Hello, everyone. My name is L.J. Stambuk. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, and I'm delighted to have you with us today participating in this conversation. We have with us a famous, the legend of our diplomacy, Ambassador Thomas Pickering, and also joining us is Batmanghelidj. Thank you very much for being here. I'll talk a little bit more and then I will turn it over to you. In these difficult times, we don't have live programs. We have programs that are virtual, and we're delighted that we're able to do so and get people like you who know so much about the world to explain things to us a little bit more. Ambassador Pickering, I'll just mention that we had a live program with you in 2017. We would love to have a live program with both of you, but we are kind of restricted at this time and we cannot do that. But the invitation stands where once we can have a live programs again at the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, for both of you to come to Charlotte and Ambassador Pickering for you to come back. We would love to give you a little bit of the Southern hospitality, the Charlotte hospitality, and have you talk to us what's going around the world. So as you know, most of you know, the World Affairs Council is a non-profit, non-partisan organization that promotes conversation and learning about international foreign affairs. Education and knowledge about what's going around the world is more crucial now than ever. For our democracy to work, we need to have an educated citizen. And with a global pandemic, it just shows how interdependent we all are and connected around the world. We are on Zoom today. We're using the Zoom system to have this conversation today. And the Zoom system has a toolbar. And on that toolbar, which you can see on the slide, there is a question and answer box. Please have your questions, your participants, in this box so that both Ambassador Pickering and Yar can answer your questions as they come in. So thank you for using the question and answer box, and we're looking forward to a lively discussion with a lot of questions coming up. This presentation, as all of the World Affairs Council presentations, will be recorded, and we will have this recording available to you within 2 days. All of you that have registered today, please make sure that we have your emails so we can send you this recording. Feel free to share this recording with your friends, colleagues, family, and other organizations. We do share these recordings with schools in this whole region, with other nonprofits, and companies that are interested in what's happening in Iran at this point of time. So it gets a wide distribution. One more thing, please. Today, if you enjoy the free program that we're providing and the programs we have provided and will provide, please be aware that without live programs, the World Affairs Council has no access to revenue. We depend on you, our members, potential members, and supporters to help us survive, sustain ourselves in these difficult times. So if you can, please make a small donation or become a member or upgrade your membership. We would appreciate it very, very much. So I will start with Esfandyar. Batmanghelidj is the founder of Bourse and Bazaar, a think tank focused on issues of economic diplomacy and development in the Middle East and Central Asia. His scholarship on Iran's political economy, public health, and social history has been published in peer-reviewed journals and in the Encyclopedia Iranica. He's also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Esfandyar graduated summa cum laude from Columbia University, where he studied international political economy. Now, this is a long one, and it's only very short compared to everything that we can say about Ambassador Thomas Pickering. He served for more than 4 decades as a U.S. diplomat. I might add, as a lead U.S. diplomat. He last served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the 3rd highest post in the U.S. State Department. Ambassador Pickering also served as ambassador to the United Nations, the Russian Federation, India, Israel, and Jordan, and holds the personal rank of career ambassador. Ambassador Pickering received a bachelor's degree from Bowdoin College and a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Mr. Pickering was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship to the University of Melbourne in Australia and received a 2nd master's degree there. He has received the Distinguished Presidential Award and the Department of State's highest award, the Distinguished Service Award. Ambassador Pickering is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the International Institute of Strategic Studies. He speaks French, Spanish, and Swahili, and has fluency in Arabic, Hebrew, and Russian. As I said, if you can, please donate or become a World Affairs Council member. It would be very much appreciated. More importantly, it will help sustain the global education mission that the World Affairs Council is promoting in this region. So without further ado, we try to keep the role of the moderator to a minimum. We would like to turn over to you and share with us, please, what is happening in Iran, what is happening in the Iran-US relationship, and all the other updates you might have on the situation in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, LJ, for the kind invitation to speak to the Council and its members and guests today. With your permission, I'm going to share my screen because I've prepared a few slides to help run through my comments and thoughts on US-Iran relations. So if you'll allow me one moment. Hopefully you see my screen now, full screened. Okay, wonderful. Well, again, thank you for having me. So I've decided in discussing with Ambassador Pickering that I was going to discuss really how Iran currently views the prospect of further diplomacy with the United States. And I'm going to share three observations and talk you through them. But before I do that, I thought I would go slightly beyond my bio and talk a little bit about my vantage point, because I think that's important in terms of giving you a sense of understanding how I'm approaching the issues at hand. So I'm Iranian American. I grew up in McLean, Virginia. And as the bio mentioned, I studied at Columbia University. I have spent the last 5 years working in London, basically as an interlocutor between the business community and the policy community in Iran and in the West, primarily in Europe. And that has meant that I focused really on the mechanics of Iran and its economy rather than the political messages that are coming out from Iran that we often read on a daily basis in the headlines. And it's that focus on the mechanics that has given me a little bit of optimism actually about where we might be heading given everything that's happened in the last few years. So these are my three observations for today's webinar. The first is that maximum pressure, which is the strategy that the Trump administration has employed over the last couple of years of placing economic pressure on Iran, is a failed policy. The second observation is that the US has, through this strategy, squandered a lot of goodwill, and that this will complicate diplomacy moving forward. And the third observation is that despite that, a new deal remains at hand, and if the US is able to identify its vision for constructive diplomacy and employ some discipline in pursuing it, I'm reasonably confident that diplomacy can succeed in the next couple of years, and I know that Ambassador Pickering will talk more about the pitfalls and opportunities there. So on the first observation, why is maximum pressure a failed policy? Well, if you take this strategy to be about creating economic pressure on Iran, it has in many ways succeeded. Sanctions have exacerbated underlying weaknesses within Iran's economy, and this year will be the third straight year where Iran has faced a recession. However, Iran's economy is diverse. It's actually much less of an oil economy than is commonly assumed. It's asset rich, has a large population, and remains tied to global trade, even though sanctions have complicated those trade flows. And this has given the economy a basic resilience to sanctions. And COVID-19 actually stifled or interrupted an economic recovery that was taking place at the end of last year. So what this means is that while maximum pressure has failed to collapse the Iranian economy or create a full-on crisis, it has nonetheless had a significant impact, particularly for ordinary households. And this has had a political consequence, which I will talk about shortly. So to illustrate this, I thought it might be useful to take this opportunity, now that we're all looking at these screens, to share some data. So this is survey data from Iran, a nationally representative survey, and it's a series of polls that have been conducted by a team at the University of Maryland over several years. And what you'll see is this red line is the proportion of respondents who believe that the state of the Iranian economy is very bad. And you can see that in July of 2015, when basically we were in the position where the nuclear deal had just been agreed, only a little over 20% of Iranians believed that the state of the economy was very bad. Today, it's over 40%. And this reflects the erosion of confidence and sentiment around economic performance as sanctions have really pushed Iran into a recession. However, you'll notice that the proportion of people that feel that the economy is very bad has plateaued over the last couple of years. And that might be counterintuitive because Trump has continued to impose sanctions and try and exert pressure. But this speaks to the resiliency that I've just discussed. And it shows that although the situation remains negative, it's kind of stabilized. One way to illustrate that is to look at some data that is very rarely talked about, but is increasingly being used by Iranian stakeholders to understand what's happening in their own economy. So this is PMI data for Iran, Purchasing Managers Index, and it's a standard way of measuring economic activity that's used around the world. I mean, we will have heard PMI used in the context of the US to try and understand the slowdown impacts of COVID-19. And a PMI over 50, and this pertains to manufacturing, represents expansion in manufacturing activity. And what this graph shows is that for most of 2019, manufacturing activity was actually expanding in Iran. The economy was slowly starting to grow again and move in the right direction despite pressure. But what you'll see is in the last couple months, because of the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown and the disruptions of global supply chains, that activity has really plummeted, and Iran is back into quite a sharp period of recession. So all this to say that basically there is a degree of resiliency in Iran's economy, and at best, what maximum pressure has done is put pressure on ordinary households. Now, the consequence of this is that the US has squandered a lot of goodwill. And the use of economic coercion has unfortunately turned Iranian public sentiment towards the US to a much more negative place than it really has been at any point in the recent past. And the nuclear deal was importantly, it's important to recognize this, achieved because of a strong electoral mandate given to President Hassan Rouhani in 2013. He was elected on the promise of taking Iran out from its isolation, striking a deal with the international community, and won the overwhelming proportion of the votes in that election because of that message. But today, because of the experience under the JCPOA, in which Iranians feel that President Trump unilaterally withdrew from a deal that Iran was fulfilling in good faith, unfortunately, views of diplomacy have turned quite negative in the Iranian public. So one way to illustrate this is, again, through survey data. So this is a series of polls that have tracked Iranian public sentiment towards the US over time. And again, the red line at the top is the proportion of Iranians who see the US in a very unfavorable light. And what you'll see is that since July 2014, which interestingly is the period where the nuclear negotiations were still ongoing, it has generally tracked up. You'll see that there's this period right around 2016 where the sentiment of negative sentiment dropped and positive sentiment increased. That corresponds to the nuclear deal actually being implemented. So it shows a responsiveness of public sentiment to diplomacy. But unfortunately, as the Trump administration came in 2017, which I'm circling right now, and began to impose its maximum pressure, this sentiment has turned more negative. And I see that as a liability for future diplomacy. One other way of measuring this, and I'll just highlight briefly, is that if you ask an Iranian basically what their takeaways are from the experience of the JCPOA nuclear deal, and this question was asked most recently in August of 2019. Unfortunately, 71% of respondents replied that the JCPOA experience shows that it's not worthwhile for Iran to make concessions because Iran can't have confidence that the world's powers will honor their side of the agreement. And this uptick in the sentiment that it's not worthwhile to make concessions, which in short means it's not worthwhile to engage in diplomacy, is very concerning, I think, in terms of the popular support for future negotiations. However, I'm supposed to have good news, and so that's where we're turning now. So I still believe, and this is the third observation, that a new deal remains at hand. And the reason for this is that you have to look at the mechanics of how the deal was undermined. Yes, it was undermined by Trump and the use of sanctions to basically coerce Iran, despite the fact that Iran was fulfilling its nuclear commitments under the deal. However, the deal was also undermined by hardliners in Iran, and that's important to recognize. And the reason for this, which is often overlooked, is not necessarily an ideological aversion to having a deal with the US. After all, the establishment struck a deal with the US. We have crossed that Rubicon. The issue is that the successful implementation of something like the nuclear deal and Iran's economic resurgence would have been a once-in-a-generation triumph for the coalition of reformist and moderate politicians who really brought that deal to fruition under the presidency of Hassan Rouhani. And more than anything else, Rouhani's political opponents opposed the nuclear deal for this reason. They did not want him to be the one to give this gift to the Iranian people. But the lesson of this sort of observation is that even the hardliners in Iran will want milk and honey to flow when they are in charge. And that's sort of where we're heading now. So some of you who have been following Iranian politics and seen the headlines in the last few weeks will have seen that there's a shift taking place in the political landscape. We've had parliamentary elections earlier this year where hardliners or more conservative figures were overwhelmingly successful. And the parliament has elected a new speaker, which is a very powerful role in Iran, named Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. And one of the first headlines from his first speech is Iran's new parliament speaker says talks with the US futile. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there are very few fixed positions even in a country like Iran. And Ghalibaf himself is an excellent example of this. So if we go back and we ask who is Ghalibaf, some of you may have come across his name before because he has run for president many times. And previously, he was the mayor of Tehran, which is also a very important role given that Tehran is far and away the largest municipality in the country. And in fact, in 2008, none other than Ghalibaf was at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And this is a photo of him taking a meeting there. And at the time, the New York Times interviewed him, and his message was basically that Iran needs to end its isolation. So here you have someone that in the span of 12 years has dramatically changed their tone, if you just look at the message. But as I mentioned at the top, it's important to look at the mechanics. And basically, Ghalibaf has been a consummate politician, someone to take the opposing political view. And at the time when the hardliners were in power, his political trajectory required him to be someone who was looking for international support and investment and engagement. Now that his political rivals were the reformists who had won the nuclear deal, he has adopted the other tone. But the important thing is, to the extent that him and others like him will be in charge, and Iran is facing a presidential election next year, they are going to want to rule at a time when Iran is growing and has economic dynamism. none of these figures want to preside over a country that is essentially at an economic dead end, and that's where they are at the moment. And so that gives me a degree of confidence that negotiations are possible, even with figures that might at first glance seem to be hardliners. So to conclude, there remain strong incentives for the political leadership in Iran to strike a new deal with the United States. And as the first part of that, they have tried very hard to keep the current nuclear agreement alive. And I'm sure Ambassador Pickering will talk about the calculation there. Now, of course, any new agreement is likely going to be wider in scope, needs to have more of a regional focus, and will have to be more direct in its economic incentives if it's going to make everyone happy. And behind that, trust will be key. And I think one of the key lessons of the last couple of years is that unfortunately, the US has eroded the trust, not only that had been just trying to be developed with Iran, but of course, the trust with our allies in Europe, for example, that have remained steadfast in their support of this deal. And so finally, I'd say that what we're really waiting for is almost not so much a political change in Iran, because the mechanics there remain conducive to a deal, but rather a political change in Washington where, whether it is this administration in a second term or more likely a new administration, we have a more constructive commitment to diplomacy and a more sort of assured vision of what exactly the US is going to do to restore trust and to ensure that the quid pro quo that enabled the first nuclear deal can be built upon to achieve a more robust solution moving forward. So I will leave it at that and turn it to the ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yar, for a terrific job. I have been introduced by many people, but you've done a fascinating and fabulous setting of the groundwork on which I hope I can usefully build. Thank you, L.J. Stenbock, very much too for your kind words and introduction. And the memory I have of being in Charlotte remains very, very strong. And I know Yar would like to come, and I would certainly like to come back and see you in a face-to-face activity. I'm going to carry forward the discussion to talk about three major questions here. One is what has happened recently that in one way or another helps to define and set the stage for American-Iranian policy. The second is what might be done over the next 6 months to a year to pull things back if there were obviously an interest in doing so. And Yar has come out optimistically at the end of the day with respect to Iran. And while we have a point of inflection coming up on November 3rd, 2020, in terms of who will govern the future of the United States, and with one party's win, it's much harder than the other party, my own view is that there are opportunities there and that they are important. There are some shared views and some disputed views between them. Neither, I think, administration in the United States nor Iran would want a war, particularly an accidental full-scale war in the Gulf. Secondly, I think that Iran is very much interested, despite, in fact, some confidence in the economy, in doing what it can to come out from under the sanctions regime. And while I think Yar is right, the maximum pressure will not define the answer to the problem, there is negotiating leverage built into that aspect. And finally, my own view is that in the longer run, the only real outcome for American interests and for Iranian interests is a settlement of the nuclear problem and an effort to move on to deal with the wider number of divisions between us and between those in the region. So I will talk about the divisions that have arisen in recent times and their dangers. I will talk about what can happen over the next year, and I will talk a little bit about the future beyond that, what has to be the economic basis that both Yar has set and I believe in. To begin with, the perhaps defining moment of recent period has been the withdrawal of the Trump administration from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a treaty which was designed by the United States to not allow any party to withdraw. there is no withdrawal mechanism from the treaty. The treaty was designed with time limits in it that provided for the equivalent of partial withdrawal from various parties at various aspects of the treaty. Iran from some of the nuclear limitations over time, and the United States to bring back sanctions over a period of time as incentives to Iran. That defining agreement I'll discuss a little greater in some detail when I talk about American interests over the next period till October with respect to the agreement. Trump has been involved in a maximum pressure campaign before and after the withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action. That pressure campaign has also allowed the Iranians, or incentivized the Iranians to allow them to launch a maximum opposition campaign to the pressure campaign. This has led, in the period up till just a few months ago, an escalating series of tit-for-tat actions that in one way or another carried with them increasingly the possibility of accidental engagement of military forces, which could not exclude the potential for a broader war once that got going. And you will remember those. Some of them had to do with early attacks in the Northern Arabian Sea of tankers, seemingly perpetrated by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. That also involved militia attacks in Iraq, Shia militia, closely aligned with Iran against US forces, and significant US retaliation. The US drone was shot down over or near the frontier with Iran in the Northern Arabian Sea. The United States assassinated General Soleimani, the leader of the Al-Quds force of the Iran Revolutionary Guard, the principal action arm of overseas military activity of the Iranian administration. The United States retaliated. Iran launched missiles against a major Saudi Arabian oil facility at a place called Abqaiq. The Iranians, by a terrible mistake, in the very early part of the year, shot down a Ukrainian airliner that was leaving Iran for the Ukraine, killing a large number of people, including many Iranians, unfortunately. The United States was in one time or another prepared to continue escalation, but over time saw very little coming out of that except more escalation. The Iranian Navy, in a practice exercise, made a very bad mistake in the Gulf and killed a number of its own sailors. The Revolutionary Guard Navy, which has been a dominant force in the Gulf, swarmed American naval vessels in the past period with small boats, obviously raising the question of accident and miscalculation. All of these have now, hopefully for a while, gone into a pause. And I think the pause was brought on in part by a realization that continued tit-for-tats of a military character were not getting anywhere, that neither the United States nor Iran wanted to venture deeper into another military conflict in the region, and that it was time to see what could be done to slow down that particular proposition, and that's important. The United States has begun to look ahead at the fact that in October, under the existing agreement, which is still being maintained by Iran, as Yar mentioned, and by the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese, the other parties to the agreement, there will come a relaxation of sanctions against the conventional arms trade with Iran. Iran will be able to acquire wider numbers and amounts of conventional weapons. The United States has declared itself against it and that it will take some action to deal with it. Russia and China are supportive of Iran's right to come out from under the limitations in the JCPOA. Britain and France have sided, but not with what one would call a great deal of enthusiasm with the United States. As the process goes ahead, the United States is in the very strange and invidious position of having withdrawn from the agreement that establishes the limitations on conventional arms, even though they are also in one way or another incorporated in a mandatory resolution of the United Nations Security Council. The United States seeks to take advantage of that agreement, which it has left, to find a way to extend the limitation on conventional arms trade with Iran. It is highly unlikely that Russia or China will permit that to happen in the UN Security Council. It is uncertain as to whether France or Britain would do so. They seemingly are with the United States, but one veto by Russia or China will stop the process there. The United States will be thrown back, if I could put it this way, on extending its own unilateral sanctions to seek to make that happen. That is unlikely, in my view, to achieve the objective. And in effect, what has happened is Trump is the victim of his own precipitate action in leaving the agreement in an effort to, one way or another, put down a political position. This means that coming in to the American election, Trump will have an opportunity, if he chooses to take it, not only to aggravate internationally the question of the conventional arms limitation, but seek to do it in a way that helps him gain votes in the election. Others are wary of this, and what they will do in the end is not clear. But there is a strong possibility the United States will be left isolated, both by our allies and by others related to the agreement. And clearly, the Iranians are not seeking to have a major dust-up at this time, although I have heard it said that some Iranians believe that some kind of a dust-up in which Trump lost would not help him win the election, in their view, something that they at the moment seem to be attached to. Where could we go from here? Either should the next president be Joe Biden or President Trump seek, not entirely out of the question, but pretty far afield, a meeting with the Iranians, which he's declared himself in the past in favor of, but even more importantly, something to do with the Iranians of a constructive nature to build a legacy, having won the elections as a basis for proceeding. The latter, in my view, is probably as long a long shot as one could postulate, but the Biden camp will obviously have to take on the question of Iran and where could they go. There are a number of activities that can be in one way or another useful in either preparing the way, although it's highly unlikely the Trump administration would buy into them, or conditioning the environment after the election. One set of these has to do with the continued problem of the virus, and it's highly unlikely we will have a vaccine by the time of the election, certainly not have wide enough supplies of the vaccine to make a major effect on the spread of the virus. So the question could be the reduction of sanctions on the United States side, mainly on our allies, which impinge upon their capability freely to deliver, as provided in international law, humanitarian relief for Iran, particularly in connection with the virus. And that would cover humanitarian equipment such as PPE, testing equipment, ventilators, and so on, as well as medical support from foreign countries. Some relaxation of that would, I think, be seen as a useful gesture. The U.S. has in the past weeks said it's prepared to provide aid to Iran, but Iran has to ask for it. And the Iranians have said they're not prepared to ask for it. There are ways around that conundrum. They could be essentially helped by an outside figure such as potentially the Secretary General of the UN, who could get countries to agree that all aid provided without conditions in the fight against the virus is clearly welcome by all countries in the world, and Iran would not have to take an individual act of appearing to plead for that aid to the United States. The second set of arrangements is even more important in continuing and strengthening the pause. There has been a long need for more intensive communications between the United States and Iran, particularly in the conditions of uncertainty over the military activities in the region. And so a military hotline between commanders on both sides could be a very useful arrangement in clarifying uncertainties that might arise as military forces pass close to each other or indeed may affect contact. And I think that particular issue is important. Others have suggested a broader range of activities, including something of a more permanent ceasefire added on to the pause that we have now. That would have to be negotiated. It would present some obviously important difficulties and would require some change in the American maximum pressure approach to Iran. Some effort, and the Iranians have made a proposition along these lines to assure that all of the Gulf shipping, particularly that carrying oil internationally, could be assured by all party states in the region to be allowed to travel freely and without interruption. And that could be a helpful way to proceed. I mentioned the question of the conventional arms ban and its relaxation. Maybe states could, in one way or another, allow the U.S. to go in its own direction, but having very little capacity to affect the arrangements, even were it to try to increase its secondary sanctions on American allies as a pressure on them to see whether, in fact, they would limit their trade in conventional arms, a way of solving the problem without some kind of blow-up. In addition, were the Biden administration to come in, but there may be a way for the Trump administration to do this as well. There will be a period between January and May in Iran when President Rouhani remains in charge. After that, many believe he will be succeeded by a much more significant hardliner. If that's the case, most of us who've examined this with care believe the Biden administration will have one significant shot, if at all, and that one significant shot should be to bring both parties back in to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action meeting, in a sense, condition by condition. That is, Iran, which waited a year before it moved away from the restrictions of the agreement, has done some work with centrifuges that have increased things like the amount of low-enriched uranium available to it and improved its capacity to use modern centrifuges to enrich uranium. Iran would have to go back to the limitations of the JCPOA. And the US, in order to do the same things, would have to go back and open up the sanctions put on by the Trump administration at the time it withdrew from the JCPOA. Many of those secondary sanctions which would permit our friends and allies to increase their trade and investment with Iran. That particular step would be a fundamental turning point in the situation and could lay the ground for other questions that would have to follow. My sense is the most important of those would be a follow-on nuclear agreement. The US would want to have an extension at a minimum of some of the limits on Iranian nuclear activity, which will run out beginning 10 years after the agreement was put into force in 2015. Those particular steps might be the basis for a follow-on negotiation after the parties were to rejoin the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The United States will want also to try to increase access of the international inspectors of the UN to various sites in Iran where it has been difficult to get Iranian permission on a timely basis to carry out the inspections. It is also quite clear to many of us from our contacts with Iranians, some of whom are close to the governance arrangements in Iran, that Iran itself is preparing a list of ideas that should it get re-engaged in negotiation, and the fact that they are doing so is an interesting indication of their interest, which reinforces the points that Yar made to you, that might well then be the basis for a follow-on negotiation. For a long period of time, we in Iran, they were not considered in the original agreement for two reasons. One, that a missile without a nuclear warhead had some effect, but was not transcendently important. And the second reason was certainly on the Western side, had we considered them, there would have been a significant chance we would have had to dumb down the Iranian nuclear limitations in order to persuade the Iranians to accept some limitations on their missiles. There are other questions too. Iranian support for proxies, many of whom the United States has called terrorists, Iranian activities with respect to freedoms in its own country, particularly of religious minorities, and so on. And we know many of those. There is finally one set of arrangements well beyond either the nuclear or the Iran peculiar questions that I've so far focused on. And that has to do with the very important necessity in the Gulf area for Iran and Saudi Arabia in particular to do what they can to begin to build a set of relationships that will put a much more significant damper on the current escalation between them to higher levels of contention and the possibilities of conflict. Neither gains, neither seems to want it. There are some interesting indications in the background that unofficial contacts may have already begun in some ways, but it will be very important. Were we able to be making progress both on the nuclear question and other issues, that a third set of activities be thought carefully about and looked at to begin to find a way to build a set of relationships between the Arabs and the Persians in the Gulf area, which contribute to their mutual stability and which lead to a balanced outcome rather than with some reckless abandon continued efforts in one way or another, both to undermine and destabilize each other. Again, all actions that in one way or another could lead to conflict. Turn this over to your questions, and I look forward to them as I know Yar does. And thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Pickering and Yar. I'm Mike Hawley on the board of the World Affairs Council, and I'm going to try to coordinate the questions. If you have any questions out there in the audience, please file them in the Q&A box, and we will try to get to them and cover as much ground as we can. Ambassador Pickering, just a quick note from David Asunkwo, who's a lawyer who's on the call here, and he is from Nigeria. And as we all noted in your biography, you were the ambassador to Nigeria. And he, and I'm sure many other Nigerians, would like you to know that you, the ambassador, remain the most influential U.S. representative in Nigeria and perhaps in all of Africa. And we would add the world. So thank you. Can you give us a quick glimpse as to what some of your high points were in Nigeria before we head for Iran?
I think, Mike, I'd like to thank David for his very kind words. But I always believe a little bit of hyperbole goes a long way. So thank you very much. For me, one of the great preoccupations in Nigeria was to see at that particular time, after a military government had left power, and when Nigeria was developing rapidly, heavily based on oil, but on other things, whether in fact the American business community, very interested in opening contacts and arrangements with Nigeria, could play a significant role in the development of that country. And that proceeded well. It was something that we had a mutual interest in and was in many ways, I think, very important. We also worked very closely with the Nigerian military because there were ongoing problems in other West African states of destabilization. And Nigeria was willing to put forward military units under either the West African Economic Cooperative Organization or the United Nations as peacekeepers in those regions. And we helped them in one way or another train and equip some of those peacekeepers to be participants in that effort. And we worked very hard to build regional arrangements and support them. And Nigeria continued to take a lead in doing so. Nigeria was then under civil government. It remained under civil government for most of my time there. And in fact, I left in the month of August. Unfortunately, in the month of January in the next year, 2003, a military organization in Nigeria resumed control of the country, and it took a long while for it to grow out of that particular process. But I liked Nigeria very much. I still remain very attached. I believe it has a great future as a major world country, most populous in Africa and the largest economy in Africa, all situations of extreme importance to it. And it's a country which is held together despite a civil war and many divisive trends and tendencies over a long period of time. So maybe next time I can come down and we can have a Nigeria session. Thank you.
That sounds great. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, David. I'm going to ask Yara a question, but Ambassador, if you could be thinking about this. China comes up in virtually every discussion that anybody has about any topic these days, and I wondered if you could give some thought to giving us impressions about where Iran fits in the puzzle between the global competition of the U.S., the EU, and China. But Yar, quickly for you. You talk about a possible new deal, both you and the ambassador, and unfortunately, I think Iran has been demonized to the point over the last 40 years. How will any kind of new negotiation, it's hard to fathom how the domestic politics in the United States are going to accommodate any kind of new deal. Can you comment on that?
Sure. Thank you, Mike. I think it's an excellent question, but I think we should also remember how, in many ways, the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the agreement in the manner they did actually went against the prevailing flow of political opinion in the United States. I don't have the survey data to share at hand, but I believe that the overwhelming public sentiment towards the nuclear deal in the US has been positive. And even though the deal was not submitted to Congress, which many people feel it was part of the flaw of the agreement, making it easier for the Trump administration to withdraw, there was broadly, I think, congressional support for remaining in the deal in the period in which President Trump was signaling that he may withdraw. And so I think to the extent that there's a national conversation happening in the United States about being more intelligent about our strategic commitments in regions of the world, first and foremost the Middle East, any attempt to use diplomacy rather than to find ourselves on the brink of war, as Ambassador Pickering has described, has been the case over the last year, given the brinksmanship that Trump's policy tends to entail. I think that there's going to be support for that. And certainly as we move into the presidential election, one of the strong indicators was the fact that every major Democratic candidate came out in favor of, in one way, shape, or form, re-entering the JCPOA and resuming negotiations with Iran. Finally, I'd just say that this is obviously not going to be the issue at the top of the priority list for American voters, but in some ways that's probably a good thing as well, because it gives some political space for Iran, the United States, and the other parties to the deal to hammer out the details without too much pressure, perhaps, for something perfect to come out at the end.
Thank you, Yar. And Ambassador, any follow-up there? And also, can you talk on China a little bit?
One brief point, because Mike has that Yar has made the key and important points. it wasn't that the deal was not submitted to the Congress. It was that the Obama administration was able to get Senator Corker and his team to agree that when the deal was submitted to the Senate, it would be considered only on the basis of a 60-vote cloture majority. And they didn't get the 60-vote cloture majority. So in effect, the Senate itself decided not to take the deal on. Now, the bulk of those votes were Democrats, but not all. And so in effect, Obama, in that particular case, submitted the deal, but was able to work with the Senate on a basis where he didn't have to face an up or down vote on its acceptance.
That's great. And then if you would, please, how does Iran fit into the global competition with China?
China, of course, as you know, is reaching out. The Belt and Road Initiative is a giant development program to increase China's trade, investment, and influence politically around the globe. And certainly pieces of that are aimed toward Iran and have reached Iran. China has for a long time been a major oil recipient from Iran, but China, I think quite wisely, given the uncertainties about the future of Iran, and we are seeing those in spades now, has not put all of its oil eggs in the Iranian basket. It has, of course, quite heavy dependence on Saudi Arabia and other oil suppliers. China has, in many ways, invested heavily in exports to Iran, and part of the, I suppose, important aspects of what Yar said about the more balanced nature of their economy and their ability to spend overseas has brought lots of Chinese goods and lots of Chinese businessmen to Iran, and that plays a role. I think that China's interest in Iran has been tempered, obviously, by a concern that it shared with the Russians, with the British, the French, the United States, and with the European Union and Germany, that Iran not become a nuclear power. And the Chinese have been still quite stalwart on that, as have the Russians. And so we have as well areas of common ground were we to go ahead under a new administration or under the old administration in the United States to seek to try to find a way to strengthen and rebuild the nuclear issue as the fundamental centerpiece of a relationship between Iran and the international community. That would obviously involve Chinese support, which I think would be available for sanctions reduction as long as Iran came back into compliance. We don't know, but we hope the Chinese might join a subsequent improvement of the deal along some of the lines that I laid out, and they may well have interests of their own, but they have been in favor of non-proliferation for many years and in favor of strengthening the non-proliferation regime because they know a world crowded with nuclear weapons and many decision centers about nuclear weapons is more dangerous for them as it is for the rest of us.
Thank you, Ambassador. We're going to run short on time shortly, but Yar, there are several questions that involve other players in this chess match. One of which is Israel. Vikram Kumar, who is the head of the economics department at Davidson College, would love to get your impression about what role Israel will likely play in this chess match you've described. And then if we could close it out with a comment or two from Ambassador Pickering on a comment you had made earlier, Yar, which is that we have squandered a lot of goodwill. I think you were talking about it in the context of Iran, but we have squandered it in lots of other places too. And I'm wondering if the ambassador, because we have many people on this call who either were in the diplomatic corps or are thinking about going into it, if you could talk a little bit about the current state of the diplomatic corps. So Yar, how about Israel first?
Thanks, Mike. I'll touch on Israel, but I'll also defer to Ambassador Pickering on specifically the Israeli question. But I think that, obviously the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu has been quite encouraging of Trump to put pressure on Iran to withdraw from the nuclear deal, to take a confrontational approach. But it's important to recognize that that has as much been a calculation about domestic politics for Netanyahu as anything else. It's been about him positioning himself as a defender of Israel and as someone who can mobilize the United States to act according to Israeli foreign policy interests, at least as he defines them. And the reason I make that distinction about his definition is that, broadly speaking, the intelligence community and the military brass in Israel saw the nuclear deal as at least beneficial in the sense that it eliminated the risk of Iranian proliferation with a high degree of certainty. And so I think that is still a very attractive goal for any government that is in Israel, and will remain part of the calculation around whether or not there is going to be as vociferous opposition to a new agreement. I just briefly add here that a similar calculation can be made about Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the wider GCC. And as Ambassador Pickering mentioned, one of the challenges is going to be ensuring that there's regional buy-in for a new agreement. But here, I also see an opportunity brought about by recent events in that we're really, for the first time, at a juncture where the Middle East is overall hurting economically. Unlike when the nuclear deal was first implemented, oil prices are low, and the countries of the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, although we treat them as very rich economies, they're very leveraged and they're facing a lot of economic uncertainty. And so there's a strong argument to be made that no one can afford for this kind of brinksmanship to continue, not least because they can't afford an accidental war. And the spending of state treasure on military kind of preparedness and this arms race that has been in the region for many years. And so for those reasons, I think that there is positive signs of increased dialogue, and that you can make the case, and it's up to the regional actors to make the case to one another, that there should be a new modus vivendi that basically allows peace to prevail so that prosperity can follow.
Thank you, Yar. And Ambassador, back to you for any concluding comments, and also something about the diplomatic corps. And then Lubomir, you're on.
Thanks very much. On Israel, very briefly, I thought Yar did a very fine job with it. There's no question at all that Prime Minister Netanyahu, in order to reassure his re-election in the last round of elections, needed a threat to Israel. And that threat has been for a number of years, going back to 2013, characterized by Iran. Iran has, over a period of time, lent itself to castigation as that threat by statements it makes on a regular basis about Israel, the little Satan, and the United States is the great Satan. So it's been, unfortunately, something that in one way or another, both sides have cooperated in a miserable way to make possible. There's no question at all that back in 2013, Prime Minister Netanyahu was clearly pushing for a military strike against Iran's nuclear program. And in the absence of an agreement, he had more arguments in favor of that than otherwise. But he sought to block an agreement in large measure because he distrusted the Iranians, although they kept the agreement, and in one way or another seek to find a new road of confluence between the United States and Iran. I think being quite confident that while the United States would not take the lead in launching a military attack, they would, if attacked, or if they felt it was the only way to deal with the problem, take it on. That Israel was not capable, as its military people have said, of carrying out a successful continued military effort to suppress the Iranian nuclear program. But the United States made it very clear it was not going to go to war on a situation where either Netanyahu held our coat while we went into battle, or where he started the war and then we would rush in to pull his chestnuts out of the fire. On squandering American goodwill, I would just say it's quite clear for anybody who follows with a degree of attention the fact that the United States has lost a great deal of credibility internationally. The handling of the COVID virus is just the latest development in people's clear, if I can be diplomatic, uncertainty about the United States and where it's going and how it's willing to handle the question. The U.S. has not stepped forward and provided world leadership. The U.S. has said America first. The U.S. has tried to raid other countries for resources to deal with the virus. the U.S. has not been truthful to its own people about the virus, where it was going or how it was going to develop, and we can go on from there. And there is similarly deep uncertainty. The United States will be able to be useful and helpful in recovering from the economic collapse engendered in large measure by the virus, nor in terms of what I call the latest element in the trifecta, once again, the ugly, unfortunate, and miserable resurgence of the key social problem in the United States, the mistreatment of minority communities, particularly Black Americans, particularly by police forces around the country. And we clearly have to do something significant about that, but it has international effects of great capacity. On the American diplomatic service, there's no question at all that a number of efforts, one way or another, to cut down the professional service in the United States have had their own effects. They've left the U.S. without the leadership in the State Department that took 15 to 25 years to develop. And you can't go out on the street and hire that kind of leadership. It has its own peculiar development over a long period of time in learning about the jobs and how to perform them. So recovery will take time. And people have complained pretty consistently about the lack of professionalism growing in the State Department. In large measure, the State Department has been a victim of two things. One, budgetary cuts in many preceding administrations, which have affected its capacity to hire and train the people who are now and should be in leadership positions, but out on the street, having been literally bounced out of the State Department. And secondly, a failure to, in one way or another, staff the senior State Department positions with the well-trained and skilled professionals who in many ways are the best fitted for those jobs, in my humble opinion. So we have only one person at the top level of 9 or 8 jobs around the secretary who's a professional. And we have only one person who's a professional among the 28 to 35 individuals occupying the really key posts as assistant secretaries of state who make the organization and its bureaucratic structure run. This is probably enough to illustrate for you the circumstances under which we now find ourselves. And I came to this meeting from another meeting with those who carry out the education within the State Department for our people. We must have formed a small group to raise funds to support them in this day and age. So I see that we are at the end of our time. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be with you. Hope that you're all well and stay well. And thank you, LJ, for having us, for introducing us, and for your continued great work at the World Affairs Council.
Thank you so very much, Ambassador Pickering. Thank you, Esfandyar Batmanghelidj. Thank you, Mike Hawley. I would like to thank all our participants, our members, our supporters. We have members of other councils from around the country on this call. I would like to thank you for being on this program with us. Finally, our board members, thank you for your leadership and for participating today. Let me just use this opportunity, if I may, to address and share with you that we have a program on June 11th. It is the World Affairs Council's Distinguished Speaker Series with David Rennie. He's the Beijing Bureau Chief and columnist of The Economist. And he's going to speak on how COVID-19 could reshape the global order. So if you're interested in China, interested in the US-Chinese relationship, and also interested in how The Economist is looking at the COVID-19 pandemic and how it could reshape the global order, please join us on June 11th. I believe it's 10 a.m. because of time difference with Beijing. You can find that on our website. What a pleasure, Ambassador Pickering. What a pleasure, Roz. Thank you for telling us and sharing with us so we know more what's happening with Iran, in Iran, and between our two countries. We are at this point adjourned. Have a great day. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.